I'm from Peekskill, New York, on the Hudson.
And from Peekskill, New York, you were, your mom and dad, what were they involved in?
My dad was in the hair knitting, the hair net business. That is, he made hair nets. Mm-hmm. He had a factory that made hair nets. In those days, women were working, a lot of women were working in factories with long hair, and they wanted to put the hair in nets, so that was a good business then.
How did they end up in the United States?
My mother and father came from Czechoslovakia, from a town called Ostrava, Czechoslovakia. Mm-hmm. And they came from there and immigrated to the United States. They came to New York very first, and then my mother needed to be in a country atmosphere, so they moved to Peekskill. I went to the University of Missouri in 1939. That's when I graduated from high school. Decided I wanted to be a journalist. I had been very active in journalism in high school, and I decided I wanted to be a journalist. I admired what journalists did. I thought it was very exciting, glamorous work. So I decided I wanted to be a journalist, and I heard that the University of Missouri School of Journalism was one of the best schools of journalism in the country, so I enrolled there. Well, we landed in France. We were very fortunate. We came just after, we came after D-Day, fortunate in that respect, and we landed in France. I was an artillery officer, first lieutenant in artillery. My job was as a forward observer. That is, I was in charge of a platoon that went forward with the infantry, and we would call for artillery fire against the enemy. Our biggest battles probably the biggest was at the Rhine River, crossing the Rhine, and also at the Danube. But that was my job. So we got into the war. We fought through France, Germany, Austria. I was with the 71st Infantry Division, part of the 3rd Army under General George Patton, and we ended up in Austria. In Austria, we overran we had heard as we came across Europe about these concentration camps. We started hearing stories about them, and but we didn't really see one until we overran a concentration camp in Austria. We came across a whole field in the woods of dead or dying bodies. These were Jewish inmates of concentration camp who had tried to escape from that camp and did flee from that camp when their Nazi guards abandoned them. And here they were lying in this field in the woods where they tried to flee, and some were dead, some were dying, as I say, but they were victims of that concentration camp. That was my first experience with the concentration camp. Then, as the war ended, the news of these concentration camps and what was going on began to trickle out of these towns and out of Europe. We began to hear for the first time about the gas chambers. We were in Austria on VE Day. We were heading for Vienna. My outfit was, my division, and we got orders to stop where we were. We were in the town of Steyr, Austria, about 60 miles west of Vienna. And we got orders, I guess from Eisenhower, to stop where we were and to wait there, not to go any further. We were upset about this because we wanted to go into Vienna. We heard that it's a very romantic city, but we stopped there on orders because the Russians, the word came down that the Russians were to take Vienna and we were to wait for the Russians. So the Russians came up forward, and then we met the Russians there, about 60 miles west of Vienna. That was we had a big celebration with the Russians. I remember when we came in contact with the Russians for the first time, our regimental commander was trying to talk with the Russian commander. They couldn't talk because our commander didn't understand Russian, and the other guy didn't understand English, of course, so it was a quandary how to communicate with the Russians at that first meeting. Well, I knew a little German. I could speak some German. And the Russian commander had a guy with him who spoke little German. So they called on me. I came up and I talked in German to this guy, the Russian guy, and he interpreted in Russian to the commander. That's the way we communicated. We had a pretty good team. We won most of our games. And then it came to the championship game. We were playing a team from the infantry. And the team, the winner of that team was to get a free trip to the Riviera. That was the prize. And so we played that game in the Nuremberg Stadium. We were right in Nuremberg, and that was the same stadium where Hitler had held his giant rallies, where thousands, hundreds of thousands of Germans raised their hands and heiled Hitler. And we played that football game in that same stadium. I was sort of touched by that fact. But we got out on the field to play this football game. At that time, the troops were still segregated, blacks and whites. And we got out on the field, and we were warming up, and my quarterback runs over to me. I was on the side. He said, "Coach, I got to talk to you." I said, "What? What's the matter?" I said, "Coach, I can't play this game." I said, "What are you talking about? Are you injured? Are you hurt? What's the matter? Why can't you play?" He said, "Coach, look over there." And somehow a black player had gotten on the other team. Because there were a lot of black soldiers in Europe, American soldiers in Europe, and somehow one had gotten into this division, this outfit. And so they had a black player on their team. He said, "Look over there. He didn't call him a black, he used the N-word, that's what he called him. I said, "So what?" I said, "So what? He's an American soldier, just like we all are. What's the matter?" "Coach," he said, "you don't understand. You don't understand at all. I'm from Georgia. We don't play with the blacks. We don't play with them. We don't play against them. If I ever played in a game with a black player, why, my father would beat me. He really would." I was stunned. Here was the referee coming over. There was in this vast Nuremberg Stadium. There wasn't many in the crowd, but the referee come on, coach, let's get started. You're holding up the game." I said, "Just a minute," because I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any other quarterback, really. So I called him aside, and I just made a speech to him about what this war was all about, what America was all about. I said, "Do you realize we fought this war against racial prejudice? One of the reasons we fought this war, we're in the stadium, the same stadium where Hitler spouted all this racial prejudice, the super race and the master race. We're in that same stadium. We went to war to fight that kind of prejudice. That's where Americans were killed, fighting for that principle, that all men were created equal. And here we are fighting. We fought and died for that principle, and here you are. You've just, as another American soldier, you're telling me you won't play in a game with him." I says, that betrays what your buddies fought and died for, to do that. So I had to talk for a long time. The referee kept telling me we were going to forfeit the game and so forth. I had to talk for a long time, but he finally said, "Okay, I'll play in the game, but I want you to make one promise." I said, "What was that?" "You'd never tell my dad that I played in this game." I said, "What would happen if I did?" He said, "He'd beat me. He really would." So we played the game. The black player was very good. He was the star of the other team. My quarterback played well also, but we lost the game 20-14, and we didn't get to go to the Riviera. That what was happening in Europe was fascinating. I realized this was an opportunity to really become involved in the biggest stories of the day. I knew what was happening there was whether we were going to go to war with the Soviet Union or not, or what was happening in the Nuremberg trials were just starting up. There were so many big stories that were happening in Europe, both in Berlin and the rest of Europe. So many big stories. I felt this is the place to be if you're going to be a journalist. This is the place to be. So I didn't go home. I was discharged, but I didn't go home. I said, "No, I want to get a job here." So I was honorably discharged there in Germany, and I took a job with the Stars and Stripes. I applied, and they hired me on their copy desk, both as a copy editor and as a reporter.
Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, our chief prosecutor, spoke for most of us.
If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say there has been no war, there are no slain, there have been no crime.
But I did go to the trial. I attended the trial. I worked on the stories coming out of Nuremberg on the copy desk. I rewrote stories. I wrote the headlines. And then sometimes I would go to attend the trials. And later on, when the other trials started coming up, the 12 other trials that they had after Nuremberg, you know, I think people may want to know that after the main trial, which was an international trial, there were 12 other trials that the United States conducted in Nuremberg. They were under the supervision of General Telford Taylor. Telford Taylor had been Jackson's assistant at the main trial. And then when Jackson finished the main trial, he turned the other trials over to Telford Taylor. So I was assigned to cover some of those trials. For example, the Krupp Trial and the Farben, those trials.
You wrote in an article that said, "I still remember the first day I walked into the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg. That was the name of the courthouse where the trial was held. The city lay in ruins, devastated by an Allied air raid just a few months before, bodies still buried beneath the rubble. I remember sitting in the press gallery a few feet away from Goering, Hess, Ribbentrop, and others. I looked at them. Who are they? And who were they?"
Who are they? Who were they? Right, that's what I thought. Well, they were representatives of Jackson wanted to get representatives of all different categories of the Nuremberg government, the Nuremberg hierarchy. So some were military people, like Hermann Goering. Well, no, they had two generals, General Wilhelm Keitel, and there was another general, Jodl. Then there were two military people, Raeder and Donitz. So they represented the military. Then there were people from finance. Halmer Schacht, for example, had been Minister of Economics. There were people from the press area, like Hans Fritzsche, Goebbels. Well, Goebbels wasn't there. Goebbels had already committed suicide before the trial. He wasn't on trial. You had the foreign minister, Ribbentrop, and you had people from all walks of life like that. But one area he didn't get, that he was disappointed that he didn't get, was the industrialists. He wanted a representative of the industry, which had really supported Hitler and helped Hitler gain his power. And so he wanted, actually, the main industrialist in Germany was Alfred Krupp, K-R-U-P-P, who was owned and ran the great dynasty, the Krupp industry, which had so many different industries. Mainly, it was known for manufacturing munitions, of course. But he didn't get, there was a mistake made. It was a very peculiar thing. At the London Agreement, the London Conference, which preceded the trial and made the agreement which went the trial go forward, it was thought that Krupp was on the indictment list, but somehow his name was not on that list. And they realized the mistake when they got to Nuremberg. And so Krupp was not on the list of defendants. Jackson made a motion to the court. This is very important, this motion. He made a motion to the court to place Goering on the list. Well, see, Krupp's father was on the list. Krupp's father was Gustav Krupp, who'd owned and ran the Krupp industry before the war. But during the war, his son Alfred ran the Krupp dynasty. So the mistake was putting Gustav's name on the indictment list instead of Alfred's. So Jackson realized the mistake had been made, and he made a motion to the court to substitute Alfred Krupp, the son, for the father, Gustav Krupp, because Gustav Krupp couldn't even appear in court. He was too senile. He had to change him like a baby. He couldn't control his functions. And so he couldn't really appear in court, so that's why Jackson made this motion. And the court denied that motion. The court said, this is not like they made a remark, one of the judges, I think it was Lawrence, the presiding judge, who said, this is not like an American football game where you can substitute players for each other. You can't do that here. So the motion was denied. Now, the fact that Jackson's motion was denied, one of the first motions he made before the court, and they denied that motion, that impressed the defendants, because for the first time, they realized that this court was going to be fair to them. We might have a fair trial here after all. We're not going to be railroaded. We got a court that just denied Jackson's big motion. So that fact was important to the defendants. There was much praise of Jackson. People respected him for what he was doing. Everyone realized that he was really the engineer of that trial. He designed the concept of the trial. He was the engineer of the trial. He was in charge of, he wrote out the counts, the four main counts. That was all Jackson's idea. And especially when they heard his opening statement, I mean, that opening statement, it was great. It really was. It was a masterpiece. Of all, it's probably the most single piece of literature, the best piece of literature about Nuremberg, of any single piece of literature. If a person could only read one statement, one piece of literature about Nuremberg, then the one that they should read is Jackson's opening statement. And he was praised highly for that. The press praised him. And the reporters who were there, and the other lawyers who were there, they were really impressed by that opening statement. It was very moving. And so he was praised for that. But there were times when he was not praised. He was not praised at all for his cross-examination of Hermann Goering, for example. And people thought he did very badly with that cross-examination. But he was also praised for the fact that he wanted this trial, it was his idea to make this trial public. I mean, he wanted the public to know what was going on. We weren't going to have a proceeding behind closed doors, as they often did in Russia. No, he wanted the public to know everything was going on. And so they were impressed with that, and they respected him for that. So you had both sides, but there was criticism, I must say, with regard to his cross-examination of Goering.
Did you get a sense as when the detail of that cross-examination that the real problem was Judge Lawrence and the tribunal letting Goering go as compared to the argument?
Absolutely. Actually, it wasn't Jackson's fault. It looked like his fault, but it wasn't his fault. I mean, he was right on the law, you see. He wanted Goering to just answer the questions. What Goering would do, he would listen to the questions, he would wait and have it interpreted, even though Goering understood English perfectly. He would wait to give him an idea how to answer the question until it was interpreted, and then he would answer the question. But he wouldn't just answer the question. He would go off and spout this Nazi propaganda, you see, and Jackson objected to that. He said, just answer the question. And Jackson said to him, if you want to say more about this, then your attorney can ask you about it on redirect examination, see? So he objected to letting Goering go that way. And the court said, and the court was just leaning over backwards to be fair, I think. The court said, no, let him speak. We want to let him have his say. This made Jackson livid. He lost his cool, really. He became livid. And he made a statement to the court, you're letting this whole trial get out of hand, he said. You're letting it all get out of hand by doing this. I mean, he chastised the court. And so he didn't like that at all. He was upset with that. And so people, and the criticism for the press was great, really was great. I mean, it was, and Jackson, as I understand it, he was moved by that criticism. That touched him. He felt embarrassed by that criticism. He was always in a dark suit. He always wore a vest. He always had a gold chain across his vest. Remember that? He was an imposing figure. That's the way I would describe him. Jackson's main goal, one of his main goals, was to deter war and the atrocities of war. I think that was the main reason he went to Nuremberg. He had this passion about peace. To deter war and the atrocities of war, he feared he really feared that civilization could not survive another world war. And so he wanted to send a message. He wanted to send a message to warlike leaders all over the world. He wanted to send this message, that if you commit war crimes, if you wage aggressive war or conspire to wage aggressive war, if you commit crimes against humanity, then you could be brought before a court, an international court of law, and face serious consequences. That's the message he wanted to send to them. And he hoped that that message would deter them from going into warlike enterprises.
What was the talk in the press room in anticipation of the verdicts as far as how it would come out? Everybody must have had their ideas.
Most people thought they would all be found guilty. Yeah. They were surprised when 3 were acquitted. Yeah.
How about you?
I was surprised, yeah. I was surprised too. I thought everyone would be found guilty. From the very beginning of the trial, that was the feeling among all of us that, they're going to be found guilty. He achieved some of his goals. He failed in 3 major goals. He didn't stop war. There've been 100 wars since Nuremberg. He didn't stop war. Now, he was not so naive as to think he was going to stop war just like that. He was not that naive. But he thought he would hope to deter war. It is possible that there were leaders who were deterred from going into war, like starting a war, because of the Nuremberg trial. That's possible. We don't know that. But we just know that many wars continued to occur. He didn't stop the atrocities of war. We know from, Rwanda and Cambodia and Kosovo and Bosnia and Serbia, he didn't stop the atrocities of war. And one other thing he didn't accomplish. He wanted an international criminal court. He wanted a court where these warlike leaders who committed war crimes could be brought to justice. He wanted them to know that this court existed. Well, the International Criminal Court didn't come into being until over half a century later, till 2002. And then, ironically, we're not part of it. We're not part of it. So in those 3 aspects, I think Jackson failed. But he succeeded in many, many others. Many others.
Is he an American hero?
I think he is. He should be acclaimed as an American hero. I felt that when he came home after the trial, that they didn't give him a sufficient acclaim for what he'd done. I don't think so. I think he should have received, a hero's welcome. Instead, as I understand it, he just quietly slipped back on a seat at the Supreme Court and did his duties. But I consider him an American hero, even though I also consider that he had his faults also. He was a human being and he had his faults. He committed indiscretions at times, but he was, to me, an American hero because of what he accomplished.
Destruction of the IG Farben explosives plant is part of the well-mapped Allied plan to blot out Nazi war industry.
Military Tribunal number 6 will come to order.
Taking the Farben case first.
Yep.
I mean, Farben was another industrial giant who had run some of the factories in the concentration camps, building things like They made machine parts, airplane parts. Farben did that. And they had these Jewish inmates operating these plants. And I've talked to these people who worked in the Farben plants, these survivors. I've talked to them. I talked to one who lives in San Diego. And they were treated cruelly. I mean, they were given very little food. They were suffering from fatigue. I talked to one man who hurt he hurt his hand in a machine, had his fingers cut off in a machine while he was working in the Farben plant. This was at outside Auschwitz-Birkenau plant. And he didn't receive proper attention. But I think in the Farben trial, I think the Farben defendants were not treated severely enough. That's what I think about the Farben trial. The Krupp trial Krupp really owned. He ran most of the concentration camps. He ran the factories in those camps. That's what Krupp did. And he organized those camps and the factories in those camps where he kept those people working. And he transported the Jewish inmates, Jewish survivors, and he transported them to other camps to work in other camps. That's what Krupp did. Krupp should have been in that main trial. He was just as bad. He was bad or worse than any of the other defendants in the IMT trial, because he was a strong supporter of Hitler, and he managed, as I say, those concentration camps, and he looted those occupied countries a great deal.
He ultimately ended up with, what, 12 years?
That's another thing that I complained of, right. He was sentenced originally to 12 years in prison, confiscation of all his property. He was a very rich man. Confiscation of all his property. That was the sentence that I covered. That was in 1948. 3 years later, 1951, we were at the height of the Cold War. We thought that we might have to go to war against the Soviets. 3 years later, he was released. All his property was returned.
And the idea was, of course, Germany's an ally.
The United States looked at people like Krupp, people like Farben, and realized they needed them if we went to war against the Soviet Union. We wanted them as our friends. We wanted them to support the American military. And that's why Krupp was freed, and that's why those sentences got so light. Most of those sentences, of those 12 other trials, most of those sentences were cut down. Cut down at later time, after a few years. Those people were released after a few years.
Did that bother you?
Yes, oh yes. Yes, absolutely. They were punished property. Absolutely. But it was a political thing. I mean, I could understand what was happening, but it was just the political climate of the time that forced that to happen. I flew in the Berlin Airlift.
How did that happen?
I was in Frankfurt at the time, working in Frankfurt. That was 1947, I believe, when the trial started. The Berlin Airlift started, as you know, because the Russians decided to cut off all transportation by Americans through the Russian zone. We needed, in order to get from our zone, the American zone, up to Berlin, which Berlin was like a little island that was divided into 4 parts, 4 zones by the 4 powers. And in order to get up to Berlin and to feed the Berlin people in our zone, the western zone of Berlin, well, we had to go through the Russian zone by train or plane, or not by plane, but by train mostly. We were bringing coal and food up to the Berliners. Suddenly the Russians cut off their entering their zone and said, we're not going to let American trains go through here. And so that's what started the Berlin Airlift. The United States decided we will support the Berliners. We will support the people in the Western Zone in Berlin. And the only way they could do that was flying airplanes loaded with coal and supplies into Berlin. So my idea, and I asked my editor if I could do it, was I could fly in one of those planes. And so I flew in a Berlin Airlift plane, and it was amazing because you go to the Frankfurt airport, there's at Rhine-Main airport, there was these, I went there at midnight, and it was lined up with maybe 50 or 60 airplanes in a line, all waiting to take off, all loaded with coal and food, potatoes and whatever to bring up to Berlin. And every 3 minutes, a plane would take off and fly up to Berlin. Then would unload and would fly back again. Get another load and would fly back again. That's the way it worked. It was an amazing feat by the United States to do that. I was United States Air Force. I believe Curtis LeMay was the general in charge.
So at one point, you decide you're going to jump on the flight.
Right,
What
absolutely.
was that like?
Well, there were no seats for me. I was sitting on a bag of coal, I think it was. There were no seats, of course. And I talked to the pilots about the work that they were doing, and they were telling me how often they had to fly up there and fly back. I got that part of the story. And I realized I was taking part in a really great event, a historic event.
At some point, you fly over the point, and there are Klieg lights, the Russian Klieg lights. That must have been unnerving.
Oh, yes, that's true. You never could tell when you could be fired on.
How could the victors erase Hitler from the minds of the Germans? They began by checking out all the municipal civil servants, then dismissing 2,600 Nazi party members. The conquerors saw this denazification process as laying the groundwork for democratic renewal.
Well, denazification trials generally. See, Jackson, and this was not a thing that really succeeded that well. Jackson wanted to denazify Germany. He wanted to cleanse Germany of the Nazi element. So after the main trial, he arranged it so there would be other trials of Nazis and then they would be charged with helping the Nazi party or aiding and abetting Nazi goals. So there were what we call these denazification trials. And denazification trials were going on all over the Western Zone. The French were holding them, the British were holding them, and the Americans were conducting them. And one of the denazification trials was of Emmy Goering, Goering's widow. She had been a German actress, both movie actress and on the stage. She was a very good-looking woman and spoke very well. And so I went down. The trial was a very small trial. I mean, it was I believe in a house alongside of the street, a large house. I remember I had to sit on the floor to watch it. I was the only reporter there. Most of the trial was taken up with her defending Herman, defending her husband, and saying how she was wrongly convicted and everything. That was what she said mostly. She made actually a good impression, but I really don't remember whether she was found guilty or not. But nothing came of it. Nothing came of it. The legacy of the Nuremberg trials today is that it influences every war crime trial that's being conducted. Saddam Hussein can thank Nuremberg and can thank Jackson for being alive, for having a chance to defend himself in a court of law. People don't realize that was a precedent set by the Nuremberg trial. The fact that Saddam Hussein is having a trial. Slobodan Milosevic, the former president of Yugoslavia, he's at trial now at The Hague in the Netherlands. He can thank Nuremberg and Jackson for the chance to have a trial. If it had not been for the influence of Nuremberg, those men would have been shot and hung up in the public square like Mussolini was when he was shot by his enemies in Italy, in Rome. That's what they did to him, and they would have done the same thing to Hussein and Milosevic. Had it not been for the mood that had been created in Nuremberg, that no, you've got to give these leaders, you've got to give them a fair trial. But Nuremberg established that such a thing as crime against humanity, and that was a great, great achievement.